If you're thinking about selling your home in Alamo Heights, there's usually a moment before anything actually happens where something begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, where the house still works, but maybe not in the way it used to, where your routines have changed or your priorities have evolved just enough that you start asking a different kind of question. Not what's my home worth, but does it still make sense for me to be here? And that is really important to understand, is that most people don't go from staying to selling in a single decision. There's a middle phase. And if you're watching this, you're probably somewhere in that phase right now. Not fully committed, not fully decided, but thinking more seriously than you were before. And that's actually the smartest place to be, because the best selling decisions are not reactive. They're intentional. They're made with a clear understanding of what you're solving for, because what we see over and over again is that sellers who rush into the process without clarity tend to second guess themselves later. Not because selling was the wrong decision, but because it wasn't fully thought through at the beginning. And that's where unnecessary stress comes from. So what I want to do today is walk you through 7 things you should understand before you decide to sell your home here. Not how to sell, not how to prepare, but how to think about the decision itself. Because once that decision is clear, everything that follows becomes significantly easier, more structured, and more aligned with your goals. And the first thing you need to know is you've got to understand what you're actually trying to change. Because most sellers start by focusing on the house, when the real decision is almost always about lifestyle. Maybe the home feels larger than you need, and maintaining it takes more time than you want to give it. Maybe it feels smaller than it used to and no longer supports how you live day to day. Maybe your routines have shifted. Your priorities have changed. Your long-term plans look different than they did when you bought the home. And sometimes nothing is technically wrong at all. It's just a sense that it just no longer fits the same way. And that's important, because if you don't clearly define what you're trying to change, it becomes very difficult to evaluate whether selling actually solves that problem. And this is where many sellers get stuck, because they begin exploring the market without first understanding their own motivation. So every piece of information feels incomplete when they're looking around. Pricing feels unclear, timing feels uncertain, and the entire process feels heavier than it needs to. So the first step is not looking at listings, it's not calling a contractor, it's not trying to time the market, it's stepping back and asking a very simple but specific question. What would need to be different for this move to feel like it was the right one? And once you have that clarity, even if it's not perfect clarity, just a direction, the rest of the process starts to organize itself around that. And that leads directly into the second thing you need to understand, which is that selling is not your only option. And this is something that is often overlooked, because the moment someone starts thinking about selling, the assumption becomes that selling is the next step. But in reality, there are always multiple paths forward. And part of a good decision is understanding all of them, not just the most obvious ones. Sometimes staying and making the targeted changes to the home solves a problem more effectively than moving. Sometimes waiting allows your timing to align better with your next step. And sometimes selling now is exactly the right decision. But the key is that you're choosing between options, not reacting to pressure. And this is especially important in a market like Alamo Heights, where decisions tend to be thoughtful and measured, not rushed, because buyers and sellers here tend to take their time. They evaluate carefully, they move when things make sense, not simply because of external noise or market headlines. And what that means for you is that you have the space to think. You have the space to evaluate. You have the space to make a decision that actually aligns with your goals, instead of feeling like you need to act quickly. And that understanding alone removes a significant amount of pressure from the process. Because instead of feeling like you're on a timeline you didn't choose, you're operating within a framework that you control. And that's where better decisions tend to happen. And that leads directly to the third thing you need to understand, which is how this specific market behaves. Because Alamo Heights, it really doesn't function the same way as the rest of San Antonio. It doesn't respond to the same broader trends, and it doesn't reward the same strategies. This is a true micro market where buyers are highly informed. They often are emotionally connected to the area and willing to wait for the right home. And the last piece is especially important because it changes how timing works. In many markets, timing can feel like the dominant factor, but here, Positioning tends to matter more than timing because buyers are not just reacting to what's new, they are comparing what's available to what they've already seen. Sometimes months ago, sometimes even years ago. They remember layouts. They remember pricing. They remember why certain homes didn't work for them, and they carry that information forward into every new decision, which means when your home comes to market, it's not being evaluated in isolation. It's being evaluated in context. And that context is what drives outcomes. That's why two homes on the same street can have completely different experiences on the market. One may generate immediate interest and strong offers. We've seen this, while another may sit longer than expected. And that difference is rarely random. It's usually tied to how the home aligns with buyer expectations, understanding that early allows you to approach the decision to sell with a much clearer lens. Because instead of relying on general assumptions about the market, you're evaluating how your specific home is likely to fit within this very specific environment. And that shift from general thinking to specific thinking is what sets everything up that follows. Once you understand how this market behaves and how your home is likely to be evaluated within it, the fourth thing you need to understand before deciding to sell is how buyers in Alamo Heights actually think. Because this is where a lot of well-intentioned sellers misread the situation. Buyers here are not just reacting to what's currently available. They are building a long-term mental framework of the market. They've been watching for months, sometimes years. They've walked through homes. They've ruled things out. They've adjusted their expectations, and they carry all of that forward into every new decision, which means when your home comes to market, it's not being evaluated in a vacuum. It's being compared to everything they've already seen and everything they're still waiting for, and that creates a very different dynamic than what people expect. Because instead of buyers just feeling an urgency because something is new, they're asking very specific questions. How does this compare to the last home we liked? How does it solve the issues we saw in the other properties? And is this the one we've been waiting for, or should we keep looking? And those questions are happening quickly, often within minutes of seeing a home, either online or in person. And that means for you, when you're selling, it's not just putting the home on the market. It's about entering an ongoing conversation that's already happening in the buyer's mind. And the more you understand that, the more clearly you can evaluate whether your home is likely to resonate immediately or whether it may require more preparation, more positioning, or even different timing strategy to align with those expectations. And that leads directly to the fifth thing you need to understand, which is pricing psychology. And this is one of the most important concepts to grasp before you ever make the decision to sell, because pricing is not just a financial decision. It's a communication tool. It tells buyers how to interpret the home, how seriously to take it, and how quickly should they act. And in a market like this where buyers are already thoughtful and often patient, pricing too high does not create negotiation leverage. It actually creates hesitation. And hesitation is where momentum starts to slow down, because instead of buyers leaning in and engaging with the property, they step back and wait. Once a buyer feels like they can wait, they usually do. And that's when the dynamic begins to shift, because the longer a home sits, the more the conversation changes. Instead of, is this the right home for us? Buyers begin asking, why hasn't this home sold? And that shift in perception can happen quickly, sometimes faster than sellers expect. And once that happens, you're no longer operating from a position of strength. You're working to regain momentum that was lost early on. So even at the decision phase, before you've committed to selling, it's important to understand that pricing is not about testing the market. It's about positioning within it. And the goal is not to see how high you can go. It's to create a response that brings the right buyers into the conversation at the right time. And understanding that ahead of time allows you to evaluate whether your expectations align with how the market is actually going to respond. That clarity becomes incredibly valuable because it prevents you from entering the process with assumptions that may not hold up once the home is actually listed. From there, we go to the sixth thing you need to understand, which is readiness. And this is where everything we've talked about starts to come together, because readiness is not just about whether the home looks good or whether you've completed a list of updates. It's about whether the entire situation is aligned, your goals, your timeline, your expectations, and your next step. Because one of the most common reasons sellers hesitate or feel overwhelmed It's not uncertainty about selling itself. It's uncertainty about what happens after. And, that's completely normal because selling is rarely a standalone decision. It's usually connected to another move, whether it's buying or relocating or changing your living situation in some way. When that second decision is unclear, the first one becomes much harder to commit to. So part of readiness is not just prepping the home, it's preparing the full picture, understanding your timing, your flexibility, and how all these pieces fit together in a way that feels manageable. And this is also where I want to take a moment to introduce myself more directly because this stage of the process is where we spend most of our time with clients. I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company. I work here in San Antonio, especially Alamo Heights, and we focus on helping homeowners navigate this exact phase, not just when they're ready to list, but when they're still evaluating whether selling even makes sense, because that's where the most important decisions are made. And what we've consistently seen is that when sellers start earlier, when they take the time to understand their options, their numbers, and what preparation might look like, the entire process becomes more controlled, more predictable, and significantly less stressful. Because instead of trying to solve everything in a short window of time, you're making decisions gradually, with context, with a clear understanding of how each step fits into the bigger picture. And that's really what readiness is about. It's not urgency, it's alignment. And when you reach that point where your goals, your timing, your expectations all make sense together, the decision to move forward tends to feel, much more natural and much more grounded. And really, you start to feel more confident. And that's the position you want to be in before you ever take the next step. And once you work through how this decision actually functions, understanding what you're trying to change, recognizing that selling is just one option, seeing how buyers think, how pricing shapes a perception, and what true readiness looks like, the seventh and final thing you need to understand before deciding to sell your home in Alamo Heights really is that clarity is what ultimately removes the pressure from the entire process. Because what creates stress for most sellers is not the transaction itself. It's the uncertainty that exists before and during it. It's not knowing if the timing is right, not knowing if the home will be well received, not knowing if the outcome will match their expectations. And when those questions are unanswered, even simple decisions start to feel heavy. But when you have clarity, when you understand your goals and your options and how the market works and how buyers are likely to respond and what your next step looks like, that pressure begins to disappear. And what replaces it is control. And that shift from pressure to control is what allows sellers to move forward with confidence instead of hesitation. And this is also where everything we've talked about comes together in a very practical way. Because when you look at these 7 things as a framework, rather than individual ideas, you start to see how they support each other. First, you've taken the time to define what you're trying to change. So your decision is rooted in purpose rather than uncertainty. Second, you understand that selling is not your only option, which means you're choosing this path intentionally, not reacting to outside pressure. Third, you understand how this micro market behaves. So you'll evaluate your home within the right context instead of relying on broad assumptions. Fourth, you understand how buyers think, which allows you to anticipate how your home will be perceived rather than being surprised later. Fifth, you understand pricing psychology, which means you're thinking about positioning early instead of reacting after the fact. Sixth, you've evaluated readiness, both from a personal standpoint and a property standpoint. So your timing is aligned rather than forced. And now seventh, you understand that clarity is what allows all of these decisions to work together in a way that feels manageable. And when that clarity is in place, the process of selling becomes much more straightforward. Not because it's simple, but because it's structured. And that structure is what reduces stress and improves outcome. And this is also where it becomes important to talk about timing in a more realistic way, because many sellers assume that timing is about picking the right moment in the market. Well, in reality, the more important factor is preparation, and we love preparation. And sellers who tend to have the best experience are the ones who started earlier than they thought they needed to, not because they were ready to sell immediately, but because they gave themselves time to understand what needed to happen before going to the market. And that preparation window, typically 3 to 6 months before listing, is where most of the meaningful decisions are made. It's where you evaluate what changes, if any, would make a difference. It's where you begin to understand pricing in a realistic way. It's where you align your next move, and it's where you remove the uncertainty that creates stress later on. When you use that time intentionally, the actual selling process becomes much more controlled because you're not trying to solve everything all at once. You're simply executing a plan you've already thought through, and that's the difference between a reactive sale and a strategic one. I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group, specialized in